Okay, so you want to own a prison, not run one for the government, own one. The building, the beds, the business. Collect a check for every person locked inside. Here is the strange part. You can, right now. Two of the largest prison operators in America, CoreCivic and the GEO Group, are publicly traded companies on the New York Stock Exchange. Anyone with a brokerage account can buy a piece of the American incarceration system before lunch. And here's the part that should stop you cold. Many of the contracts these companies sign with the government include something called an occupancy guarantee. It means the government promises to keep the prison filled to a certain level, often 80 or 90%, and if it fails to lock up enough people to hit that number, it pays the company anyway for the empty beds. Read that again. There is a business in America that gets paid a penalty when the government doesn't incarcerate enough people. If you ever wondered how prisons became a publicly traded investment, why two companies quietly built a $4.8 billion duopoly on human confinement, and why some of their investors spent last year complaining that the government wasn't locking up enough people to maximize returns. Here is how this business actually works. The first thing you need to understand is that a private prison company is not really in the corrections business. It's in the real estate business. And for years that wasn't a metaphor. It was their official tax status. Let's start at the beginning. The private prison industry in the United States began in 1983 when three men in Nashville, Tom Beasley, Don Hutto, and a man whose legal first name is actually Doctor, founded a company called the Corrections Corporation of America. In 1984, they opened the first privately operated prison in the country in a converted motel in Houston, holding immigration detainees. The pitch to government was simple. We can build and run prisons cheaper than you can. Outsource your inmates to us, pay us a daily rate per person, and save the taxpayers money. It worked. By the end of the 1980s, there were about 11,000 private prison beds in America. Today, there are well over 100,000. The Corrections Corporation of America eventually rebranded itself as CoreCivic. Its main competitor, born out of a security firm called Wackenhut, became the GEO Group. Together, these two companies now control the overwhelming majority of private incarceration in the United States. A near-perfect duopoly. In 2025, CoreCivic generated roughly $2 billion in revenue. GEO Group generated $2.6 billion. Combined, the two companies pulled in nearly $5 billion, housing roughly 8% of all state and federal prisoners in America, plus a rapidly growing number of immigration detainees. So how does the money actually work? It's a per diem model. The government pays the company a fixed daily rate for each person held. At a typical immigration detention facility, that rate runs somewhere around $80 to $180 per person per day, depending on the security level and the contract. One CoreCivic-run ICE facility in Arizona costs the government roughly $180 a day for each person detained. $180 a day times 1,000 beds times 365 days is about $65 million a year from a single facility. The company's job is to deliver that bed, the food, the guards, and the security for less than the per diem rate. Whatever's left is profit. And this is where the occupancy guarantee becomes the most important clause in the entire industry. Roughly 3/4 of private prison contracts contain one. The government doesn't just agree to pay for the prisoners it sends, and it agrees to keep the facility filled to a minimum level or to pay for the empty beds as if they were full. Think about what that does to the incentives. A normal business has to attract customers. A private prison with an occupancy guarantee has its customers delivered by the state and gets compensated even when they are not. The financial pressure flows in one direction only, toward keeping the beds full, and the entity responsible for filling them is the criminal justice system itself. Now we get to the part that explains why these companies were, for years, not even classified as corporations. Between 2013 and 2020, CoreCivic and the GEO Group operated as real estate investment trusts, or REITs. A real estate investment trust is a corporate structure designed for companies whose main asset is real estate, such as office buildings, shopping malls, and apartment complexes. REITs get an enormous tax advantage. As long as they distribute 90% of their income to shareholders, they pay almost no federal corporate income tax. The private prison companies argued that they were fundamentally real estate businesses. The prisons were buildings, the buildings were the asset, so they reclassified themselves as REITs. CoreCivic's effective federal tax rate reportedly dropped from around 36% to roughly 3%. For most of the last decade, in the eyes of the US tax code, a private prison was treated as the legal equivalent of a strip mall. The inmates were, functionally, the tenants, and the shareholders collected 90% of the income in mandatory distributions, the same way they would from an apartment REIT. This is the literal version of owning a prison. You buy shares. The company is required to hand you 90% of its profit. The profit comes from per diem payments on human beings, and the whole structure is taxed like commercial real estate. So why did they stop being REITs? Because the business has one enormous vulnerability, and in 2021 it nearly killed them. Private prisons don't have customers, they have one customer, the government, and the government is controlled by politics. In 2021, a new presidential administration issued an executive order directing the Federal Bureau of Prisons to phase out its contracts with private prison companies. At nearly the same moment, most major US banks, under public and activist pressure, announced they would stop financing the private prison industry. For companies that, as REITs, were required to distribute 90% of their income and therefore relied heavily on bank loans to fund growth, losing access to financing was catastrophic. The stocks collapsed, and both companies made the same strategic decision. They abandoned the REIT structure and reorganized as normal taxable corporations. They gave up the tax advantage, but freed themselves from the 90% distribution requirement so they could hold on to cash, pay down debt, and survive a hostile political environment. They survived. And then the politics turned again. Here is the single most important thing to understand about owning a prison. The value of the asset is almost entirely a function of government policy. And government policy swings. The day after the 2024 presidential election, shares of both CoreCivic and the GEO Group jumped by double digits in a single trading session. Investors understood immediately that an administration promising mass deportations would need somewhere to hold the people it detained, and the only companies with the spare capacity to build and run detention facilities at scale were the two members of the duopoly. The bet paid off almost instantly. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, became the fastest growing customer for both companies. CoreCivic roughly doubled its quarterly revenue from ICE in a single year, from around $120 million to $245 million. The GEO Group secured an estimated $520 million in new and expanded contracts in 2025. The largest single year of new business in the company's history, and posted a record annual profit of $254 million, a roughly 700% increase over the year before. And then came the moment that tells you everything about this industry. On earnings calls in late 2025, with detention numbers climbing towards 70,000 people, some investors and analysts expressed a specific frustration. Not that too many people were being detained, that not enough were. They had expected the detention population to reach 100,000, and at 70,000, the revenue was coming in below the most optimistic projections. Sit with that. The complaint from the financial side was that the government's incarceration machine was running below capacity, and that this was a disappointing result for shareholders. In what other industry is the underutilization of detention beds discussed as a missed revenue opportunity on a quarterly call? This is the actual product you would be buying, not a building, not a service, a leveraged bet on the scale of American incarceration and detention. When enforcement expands, your asset soars. When policy tightens against the industry, your asset can lose half its value in a month. You are, in the most literal financial sense, long on confinement. There is one more layer, and it's the one that makes the margins work: labor. Inside many of these facilities, detainees and inmates perform the cleaning, the kitchen work, the laundry, and the maintenance, and they are sometimes paid as little as $1 a day for it. This has been the subject of multiple lawsuits. From a pure cost accounting perspective, it means a meaningful share of the facility's own operating labor is performed by the people being held inside it at a fraction of minimum wage. It is one of the reasons a private operator can deliver a bed for less than the per-diem rate the government pays. So, if you do decide to buy a prison, and again, you can, it's a few clicks in a brokerage account, just remember the most important rule of this business. You are not investing in a company. You are investing in a policy. The buildings are just collateral. The real asset is the political will to fill them. When that will is strong, this is one of the most profitable real estate plays in America. With government-guaranteed occupancy, per-diem cash flow, and labor costs suppressed to $1 a day. When that will reverses, the banks walk, the contracts evaporate, and the whole structure can collapse in a single news cycle. The Corrections Corporation of America understood this from the very first converted motel in 1984. The product was never really the prison. The product was always the certainty that someone would keep filling it.